What is up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of Den of Geek presents Marvel Standom Live, where each week we give you the deepest possible dives on all the goings-on in the MCU, Marvel Comics, and beyond. And with me, for all time and always, I have Den of Geek TV editor Alec Bajali and Den of Geek News and Features editor Kirsten Howard. And special guest this week, we have pop culture writer and Den of Geek contributor Joe George. Welcome, George.
Thank you.
Welcome, Joe.
I answer to both. Multiple names is very appropriate for this.
I figured we're familiar enough now that I'm just going to start referring to you by your last name. You know, I think that's perfectly appropriate. Anyway, my apologies for that. Look, this week, folks, it is all about Creatures of the Night with Moon Knight Episode 2 and Morbius, but we'll get to Morbius in a little bit. We're going to have Den of Geek senior movies editor David Crow join us to talk about it with us. But first, let's get to all the wild stuff in this week's episode of Moon Knight. Kirsty, why don't you tell us what's going on?
Well, in the second episode of Moon Knight, Stephen is given more information about Mark Spector and his role as the Fist of Khonshu. We also meet Mark's estranged wife Layla, who is heartbroken and confused when she discovers his current situation. Meanwhile, Arthur Harrow continues to pursue Stephen as he seeks the Golden Scarab compass to uncover Ammit's tomb. And as the episode draws to a close, Stephen finds he is able to summon the Mr. Knight version of the Moon Knight suit. And he fights one of Harrow's jackals before letting Mark take over. In the episode's final moments, Mark travels to Egypt to confront Harrow after losing the scarab in battle. And
this somehow doesn't cover everything, does it? Like, this was a pretty wild episode. Generally speaking, I know that I was pretty harsh on this series last week. I did not care for the pilot at all. And I did not care for this episode when I first watched it. But you know what? On the second viewing, I found myself kind of getting more into this and feeling where they were going a little bit more. How did everybody feel about this episode?
I actually had kind of a similar experience because I kind of talked a big game about how much I hate everything that's coming up after episode 1. But on a second viewing, this is like fairly fun. I mean, if nothing else, like more inoffensive than I think I gave it credit for on first viewing. There's just some elements here that I think work. I like the Minority Report debate between Amit and Khonshu. I think it gives an added level to a villain, as Marvel so often seems to do in these cases. The final 6-ish minutes of the big fight here was some legitimately thrilling stuff. I was a little bored by what came before that in terms of action sequences. Once again, a lot of the show seems kind of like makeshift. Like, I can just imagine them moving actors from set to set. Like, all right, now we're in the Arthur cult. Now we're in the museum. Now we're outside the museum. Just a little disconnected and lifeless, but I thought this was mostly fine. Better than I remember.
Kirsty, how about you?
Yeah, this is actually my favourite episode of the 4 that we watched. I think that Stephen is still the focus in episode 2, which is interesting, as we have established he's not like the main identity. And Mark himself in episode 2 does already appear to be also a bit of a mess. He's pushed his wife away. He's got this ongoing battle with Khonshu over repaying his debt. There's clearly a lot of guilt there about his past that he isn't ready to address. In a weird way, this show seems to be constantly trying to balance the scales of storytelling, action, and character development. And sometimes it works out, and sometimes it doesn't. But I felt like episode 2, for my money, did it better than the premiere, and I really liked it. I know that visualizing a separate mirror identity has become a bit of a worn-out trope over the years, but I think it really works in this episode, even if it doesn't feel particularly fresh. I think it helps that Oscar Isaac has really thrown himself into this in a way that we can easily tell the differences between these identities too. So those are the things that definitely worked for me about this over the premiere.
Joe, how about you?
Yeah, I like both. I like all 4 episodes that I've seen. I'm going to be the positive dissenter with this, that I enjoyed them all, and I definitely enjoyed this one too. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you've said, the 3 of you, at least the 2 of you so far, but with the CG aside, I think this is a fairly visually strong episode. I mean, I agree that there's nothing groundbreaking that's happening with the way that it's visualizing the 2 identities, but I think it's helped some by the fact that Moorhead and Benson, the directors, are working mirrors into a lot of the visual language of the show. You know, the scene where he and Stephen and Layla first talk, a lot of that is told through them looking in her rear view mirror, and there's little bits like that all through the show that add a little bit more to the split personality discussion than just this one's timid, this one's brave. Now, the CG I could do without, but I'm sure we'll get to that later. But the rest of it, no, it all worked for me.
I gotta say, like, I still have my reservations, but so much more of this worked, and I noticed so many other little details about this that I started getting fascinated. And it's funny that what you say about their use of mirrors, because I was looking for significance in because this show is not as heavy on Marvel Easter eggs as we've come to expect from some of the other ones. So I've started really kind of reaching for stuff. And like, it's like, okay, so his apartment number is 502. And I took a screenshot of his door, and then I was like making mirror images, like, to see if maybe it was like, if they used a 5 and a 2, that would be perfect mirror images of each other or something. I was looking for all kinds of things like that. And so far I haven't found any of it, but I do now accept that there is something more going on here than I first was willing to admit last week. So, it's fun when it works. I think part of my problem was that watching 4 episodes back to back when I got those screeners made the things that I don't like feel a little bit more amplified, and taking a break and then coming back to it and then really being able to appreciate other details like the mirror work and like the score, which is awesome. I found myself really digging into this, and considering the fact that I liked episodes 3 and 4 more than I like these first 2, I'm looking forward to next week now. So it's a nice change. Still, this is still a pretty significant departure from the comics, and as I've often said, nobody that I know has read more Moon Knight comics than Kirsty. Kirsty, what do you think about how this is continuing to evolve the Moon Knight concept from what we're familiar with on the page?
Well, until today, you hadn't met anyone that's read more Moon Knight comics than me, but I think Joe could give me a run for my run for the money. What was the question, though? Because I've already forgotten it. Sorry, Rich, can you repeat it?
Well, I will then pose this to both of the Moon Knight experts in the room. How do you feel about the significantly, the significant departures from the comics that we're seeing here?
Well, yeah, I think Joe's got some good views on Stephen, but in terms of Mr. Knight, I knew that this was going to be a bit controversial. In the comics, Mr. Knight is like an ice cool version of Moon Knight, who is like either more of a detective or a priest, depending on the book. And the creation's mostly attributed to the repeatedly cancelled Warren Ellis. I know in the past Ellis has addressed an image he saw of the Mr. Knight suit on the show. He explained that he invented the white suit, Mr. Knight, with Michael Lark on an issue of Secret Avengers, and it was later redeveloped into the Mr. Knight persona with Declan Shalvey and Geordie Bear. I think some die-hard fans of the comics were asking themselves if making Mr. Knight so comical was a bit of a dig at Ellis. That's certainly a thought that I had when I first watched episode 2. I mean, I certainly hope so. I'm really a very petty person, so yeah, let's go for it. No, I don't have a problem with Mr. Knight being Stephen's version of Moon Knight, honestly. Declan doesn't seem to either. regarding Steven's superhero landing shot as Mr. Knight in episode 2, he wrote on Twitter, "Now that it's out there, I can say I jumped in my seat at this moment when I was at the Moon Knight screening. On top of the reveal, it totally feels like a shot I would draw." So I don't have a problem with it. I know there are a few people that do. But overall, I think Mr. Knight is fun enough. People can stay mad if they want.
Yeah, I have to admit that I at first was a little bummed to see that Mr. Knight was being played more as a buffoon than, as you say, sort of the detective slash priest, the cold and calculating version. But generally, my feeling is that the live adaptations are one thing, the comics are something different, and you are allowed to reinterpret them. And it makes sense for Mr. Knight to be the Stephen Grant version of the Moon Knight personality. So, as long as they keep doing something interesting with this version of the character, then I'm okay with them deviating from the comics. As soon as it becomes, a lesser interesting or a kind of a filler version, then I'm going to get upset and wish, why didn't you stick to the version that we have in the comics? But I feel like I have a higher tolerance for Stephen Grant shenanigans than the rest of you do. So I'm okay with it. It works for me.
Alec, for the first time ever on Marvel Standom, the comics readers outnumber the non-comics readers. So why don't you give us like I hesitate to call you a civilian because that's not true, but why don't you give us your take on some of this?
I speak for the common man. I don't know what you guys are talking about. You're going on about like this. I don't even know that character had a name, Mr. Knight. I thought that was real. I just thought that was really creative, and I thought it was. I didn't realize it wasn't like a creation for just the show and had a comic element. Why wouldn't two different personalities in one body have different interpretations of what their superhero costume should look like? I really like that element. It's actually, honestly, the introduction of Mr. Knight and just that simple concept of the presentations of like two different superhero personas in one body, it may have been my favorite thing of these first 4 episodes. It's just something that I've not seen a lot as a TV exclusive watcher and not a comic book person, really. It gets 2 thumbs up for me. I say more Mr. Knight, even if he is a little Deadpool-y.
My blazing hatred of Stephen Grant notwithstanding, like I don't have a problem with them playing Mr. Knight for laughs, mostly because like it's not like I had a particular attachment to that comic book version of it. But what you just said, Alec, about the idea that the different personalities would manifest, the mantle of Khonshu in different ways, it is really cool. And it does play into other themes of the episode. We learn here that Arthur Harrow was once an avatar of Khonshu, which is kind of cool. I love legacy hero stuff. Like, I love it. I love that they brought it in here. And we learn that Khonshu has his eye on potentially a successor to Mark. So, it does just kind of play into each of these individuals would probably look very different when they are the Moon Knight. That's probably the right place for us to talk about Layla a little bit, who in many ways is a completely original creation for the show. And from the moment she appears on screen, she is the best thing about this show. There are echoes of an important Moon Knight comic book character here as well. Kirsty, as our Moon Knight expert, why don't you start with Layla?
May Calamari. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I think I noted that it's like calamari, but like with a W. So she is instantly really likable as Layla for me. You can tell she loves Mark, but has been so hurt by him and is just trying to understand him all over again. The man she knows like an Indiana Jones type, so Stephen's presence has got to be like a huge curveball. And it doesn't take her long to become quite sensitive to it. You can read a lot of this on May's face as she's playing Layla. She's doing a lot of it without words, really. I expect that Layla has still got a lot of questions, but she's trying to understand, and it seems to be coming from a place of love. She's she's also extremely valiant herself. Like, we see her taking naturally more of a lead when she needs to. And when Khonshu threatens to make her his next avatar, it doesn't seem like an idle threat. You can see that she would absolutely make a good Moon Knight. She's smart, she's a good person, throw herself into a fight. So yeah, I like her. If this thing ends with Layla actually taking over as Moon Knight, might be alright, though I think it would be bad for her psychologically, as it is for all Khonshu's avatars, no doubt. In terms of Layla on the screen, in the comics, she's possibly just like an she's been changed from the comics into a sort of MCU version of Mark's on-off love interest, Marlene. And we do get a little bit of a hint of that being the case here in this episode. Joe, what do you think about Layla?
I think she's a real improvement over Marlene, if that's
Yes.
what they're trying to do. Marlene is kind of a standard attractive girlfriend character, and at least I've not run into many stories where they really flesh her out. So that's a welcome change. I am a little bit worried about the old, Trinity problem, where a extremely capable woman shows up to help the not so capable male character, and leaves us wondering why we aren't following the extremely capable female character who's actually the action hero here. I hope that it can pull out of that a little bit, but right now there is she's almost so dynamic for me that she runs the risk of knocking the show off balance. That eventually at some point it's going to need to answer why we care, if this is an adventure series, why we care so much about Steven and not Layla. So interesting, but I'm a little worried to see where it goes.
Yeah, I don't really get her at all. I don't really know what we're doing here. No disrespect to May, who I think does a pretty good job in the role. And one scene I actually really like in particular from her comes at the end of this episode, in which she's, telling Steven to suit up, get in the suit, and he finally just can't. And there's a moment where she's like, all right, well, just like this kind of quiet moment of acceptance, an immediate transition into what are we going to do now? Just like, I thought that was pretty effectively done. But for the most part, I just kind of don't, it feels like any time that we're spending on this story with somebody not named Moon Knight is kind of a waste of time. There's so much to delve into with this multi-personality faceted creature known as Mark Spector / Stephen Grant / Moon Knight / Mr. Knight / Khonshu, that I'm not sure why we're kind of building a world out from them rather than delving further into them. And a lot of what Layla offers here feels archetypical, kind of what Joe said, like the Trinity problem, whereas it feels like she's kind of floated in from a different project altogether, and that she deserves her own project to focus on her, while this one, which is called Moon Knight, should probably focus on Moon Knight.
I mean, we did kind of talk about this a little bit last week, where this is a character who's so complex that we probably would have benefited from a traditional origin story, and honestly, again, I don't want to keep falling into the trap of like critiquing the show that I wish this was rather than the media that we are actually consuming, right? If Moon Knight episode 1 was actually like Moon Knight season 2 episode 1, and it opens on like, wait, why is Mark Steven and why is he like this? I think we would be in a better place, because I do like Layla and I do find her fascinating, and I do think Arthur Harrow is fascinating, and we're going to get to him in a second. But it is kind of hard to get involved with these characters who clearly have something to offer, and who I think, potentially have something to offer the cosmology of the MCU. It's a little hard to get involved in them when the rest of the show is so scattered, right? But we have Layla, who is a potential future Moon Knight. And then we have Arthur Harrow, who is most definitely a past Moon Knight. We get into what his scheme is a little bit this time. And it's interesting. I think, as some folks have pointed out, it's a little Thanos-y, right? In terms of its, moral relativism. But what do we think of Harrow now that we've spent a little more time with him?
I definitely have something to say about Harrow's evil plan. It's sus. It's really, that's my 2 cents. He straight up murdered that homeless guy from what I could tell. But on the other hand, Hawk continues to kill it on this show with what is essentially quite a silly character, with a very a seemingly flawed plan. So I'm looking forward to finding out if he has an end game or what is happening.
I think at a certain point, Marvel is going to kind of have to stop this trend of complicated villains who are villainous through ideology rather than just like sheer love for evil. At a certain point, like we need like a real mustache twirler. It's kind of the missing piece of Marvel so far. But having said that, I think Arthur's ideology is at least different and interesting than what we've seen in the MCU thus far. I called it the Minority Report angle before, and I stick by that. I think it's just kind of creates an interesting dichotomy between Moon Knight and Arthur Harrow. It raises some interesting questions.
Well, what we need is Doctor Doom, of course. That's what Marvel is waiting out for, the greatest villain of all time. But I appreciate that Harrow is a supervillain. This is totally a supervillain plot, and it's very silly. And Hawks, sells it with quite a bit of emotion and almost makes you believe that this is something an actual person would say. But it's a good, crazy supervillain plot. I love it. I anytime that the show leans into the fact that it is about superheroes and supervillains, it's always going to work for me. And Hawk's performance is icing on the cake. But yeah, I'm glad that he has, these big speeches about how he's going to save the world, and then just, off somebody and says, "I'm sorry you don't get to see this," and goes on. That's exactly what I want out of my supervillains. Good stuff to me.
It was a nice surprise to find out Harrow was an ex-Moon Knight. Like, I did not see that coming, honestly. I wonder if the work that he did for Khonshu made him this way. Like, I really want to find out more of the history between those two and what he was like when he was Khonshu's avatar. That's fascinating to me.
Although it's interesting that it has not driven him away completely from wanting to be associated with these cosmic godlike beings. It's not like somebody who, like, as a lapsed Catholic myself, you know what I mean? It's like, okay, like I'm, I stay away as much as I can. You know what I mean? I'm not as lapsed as some people. Like, I don't have like a whole lot of resentment for the church in my heart, but nevertheless, like, usually, like, when it comes to religion, I feel like when people walk away, like, they really walk away. Harrow was like, he clearly got a taste of something that he liked, and now he's just kind of hitching his wagon to something that he thinks is going to get him more of what he wants, and I'm super curious about his history with Khonshu. And, like, mostly I just want more of Ethan Hawke on screen. I think his devotion is real, but, like, there's something driving it. I think it is significant that when he's giving Steven the tour of his, like, culty HQ, you can hear in the background Bob Dylan's Every Grain of Sand is playing again, and that's the song that they used to introduce him in episode 1. And it's just like they're just playing Dylan's Shot of Love album, like in the dining room in the in the cult HQ. It's awesome, and that's like a deep cut, like. So clearly he means it to some degree, but I think his ultimate motivations, they have to be a little bit more mustache twirly, to steal from Alec here, because otherwise, like, again, you don't leave complete servitude to somebody like Khonshu and then seek it yet again with somebody like Amit. That's just my take on it.
That's an interesting take. If we joined Arthur Harrow's cult, which 2 languages would you learn? Because you have to speak in 3 languages, and we're all spotted English from the get-go. So which 2 languages do you add?
Esperanto and Pig Latin, probably.
I would refuse to learn the languages, and I would ruin that lentil soup. I would ruin it. That's the problem with this cult. They're eating lentil soup, and they've gone sideways. Yeah, these people a cheeseburger immediately.
Listen, as a lentil soup stan, I gotta push back on you, Kirsty. Like, we have Lee in the comments saying Elvish and Klingon, but Lee, you're not fooling everybody. You're not fooling anybody because we know you already know Elvish and Klingon, bro. For me, I think it's to be purely utilitarian about it. It would probably be Mandarin and Spanish, because if I'm going to spread the gospel, like, you want to speak the languages that are going to reach the most amount of people, right? Now, but just me personally, like, I'd love to learn the Egyptian hieroglyph alphabet and become like a little weird, recluse like Stephen Grant or whatever. But it's I think if you're gonna go all in on a cult, Mandarin is a good way to make sure you're spreading that gospel. We touched on this a little bit, and this is gonna keep coming up every episode. The fight with another non-werewolf and the continuingly questionable special effects that this show is employing.
Andrew, you prepared a different one for every show.
Andrew's like, if they keep putting them there, like.
At least this episode had the good sense to have the not a werewolf be invisible, so we could still get the fight scene without us having to look at that Scrappy-Doo looking monstrosity that he's battling. So that all worked pretty well. I thought that was all right, but yeah, the rest of it, not so much.
I kind of like that portion of the fight. I like the not a werewolf. I like the Jackal, and I do. You're right, Joe. Making it invisible kind of added an interesting dimension to it. My issue with the show's execution is not so much in the CGI, which is imperfect, but not like an abomination. I think it has more to do with the set design. I tried to articulate that earlier. I don't know if I did it that well, but it's like I'm every different location on this show, I'm so conscious of the fact that it's a set. Like that little action set piece that leads into the Jackal fight, in which Layla and Steven kind of run away from Arthur Harrow in that little underground area. It just seems so fabricated to me, and I can see like the actors like counting out their beats of like, now I throw this punch and that punch. It's the setting and choreography that really lets me down more often than not in the show. But the CGI, I don't hate it as much. I think the Jackal's kind of fun.
The CGI wasn't great. I felt like it was slightly easier for me to ignore for the reasons we've already talked about, and that's it was invisible some of the time, and because Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead know how to frame a shot so that there was some really cool visual stuff. We've seen a lot of those shots in the trailers, but the bit where Mark reaches up and grabs and you can see the church in the background. I thought that there was a lot of really good stuff here. They've already signed on to direct most of Loki season 2, I think. I can see why Marvel was keen to keep them on. They do bring a little extra to the MCU that is perhaps lacking in the boilerplate stuff. So that made these CG easier to swallow in this one, probably. Just a combination of those factors. I didn't mind it as much, but it's not great.
I will say, though, that the non-werewolf, Anubis Jackal demon that keeps coming after Moon Knight, like, feels like a really cool, like, retro video game enemy. It just feels like something you would fight in Altered Beast or like Castlevania 3 or something. So like, I have to that's like something you would get like dozens of those coming at you before you fight a mummy in a Nintendo Castlevania game. So I appreciate that. Like, I appreciate that they're kind of just like having fun with some of these like light horror tropes, which I'd like to see a little bit more of. I think that's really it. I would just like the show to get a little bit weirder, like a little bit, like just lean. Look, I don't expect a full-blown horror show. I'm not expecting like a Netflix, almost an R-rated thing out of this. If we're gonna play with this, like, let's play with it some more. Throw some more toys out there. Should we talk about the idea of the legacy of Moon Knight? because it's something that's only been explored in recent comics. Like for much of the character's history, it was just kind of assumed that Mark Spector was it. But it makes perfect sense. Like sometimes comics, especially Marvel comics, I feel like legacy stuff works better in DC anyway. But like sometimes they try and like bolt legacies onto characters that don't necessarily support them. But with Moon Knight, when they started doing it in the comics, it's like of course there were other Moon Knights throughout history, But it's like, Kirsty, when did you say they first started exploring this?
This feels like a trick question because I never remember dates or times. So I will ignore it. But yeah, there have been a bunch of different Moon Knights over the years. There's been a bunch of female Moon Knights too. I think this is the Cullen Bunn annual where he introduced all these different versions of Moon Knight. And that wasn't too long ago. It was only a couple of years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But there have been other multiverse versions of Moon Knight too, including Mark Spector's daughter Jessica Spector and Moon Knight 2099. I think they're both female. You can read more about them on denofgeek.com/Marvel right now, because our man Gavin Jasper has done a full rundown of all the different female Moon Knights throughout history. So if you're interested to see whether Layla would be a good fit for the cape, and find out on Den of Geek right now.
Should we mention like perhaps the most famous past Moon Knight of all? Like one that is like potentially a spoiler for years down the road in the MCU, or should we keep that quiet?
Personally would like to know.
Really? Okay. All right. I could put this to a vote. Joe, how you feeling?
Spoil away. I'm always for that.
So it was recently revealed in the comics that Ravonna Renslayer of Loki fame was indeed an avatar of Khonshu at one point. So I think that's very interesting, and I wonder if there is any way at all they start playing with that, especially since Benson and Moorhead are going to go from Moon Knight into Loki season 2.
Yeah, well, we know that Oscar Isaac does not, he's only signed up for these 6 episodes. So unlike other Marvel folks, he does not have the 8 movie contract. So there's a chance if they want more Moon Knight, then it's got to be somebody else. And I am always into more Gugu Mbatha Raw, so I'd be very happy to see her be the next Moon Knight.
I will say, if this ends with Layla installed as Moon Knight after the 6th episode, I will retract my Layla complaints.
We've been kind of lukewarm on this, and especially we were super harsh on episode 1, and just internally, like when I was talking to Alec and Kirsty when we first got our screeners, things were looking bleak over at Den of Geek, folks. Let me tell you.
Den of Geek.
It was indeed Den of Bleak, and
you guys were Den of Bleak. Like I was like, there's the stuff that I really love about this, and the stuff that I was like, it's a mixed bag. I wasn't either way.
Okay,
that's it sound like I was on your side.
Yeah, that's true. I shouldn't throw Kirsten under the bus. It was mostly me. The fan reaction to this has been very different from the critical reaction, and and I'm not gonna lie, like it has made me rethink some of my own gut reactions to this as well, but like it has been met with an overwhelmingly positive response online. Kirsty, what have you been seeing?
I think a lot of fans enjoyed this episode, perhaps even more than the first one, but I do think with some it crossed a kind of cringe threshold. There's some people finding Stephen's silliness like too over the top. I maintain that some of that is just about a person's level of patience with the English, because we are super annoying. But maybe some of them have got a point, because Stephen has certainly annoyed you enough, Mike, so you're bound to have people out there that will agree with you, I'm sure.
I mean, look, by the end of episode 2, the first time I watched it, like when Mark is kicking in the mirror, screaming, "Shut up, shut up, shut up." That was me with my television, right? So,
quick question for the stands and Stan listeners. What, like that moment you mentioned where he's screaming, "Shut up, shut up, shut up," and smashing a mirror. Did anybody else hear an F-bomb? I swear he says, "Shut the fuck up." Someone will have to go back and rewatch. I mean, obviously he doesn't because it's Disney, but I'm just wondering if Oscar Isaac got something past a censor or something.
Are you sure it didn't just escape from you? Involuntarily?
I was standing on my chair screaming at the laptop.
By the way, this is a PG-13 show, so we just used our one F-bomb. That's it. No more. Like, any more than that, the MPAA hits us with an R. So, like, just want to warn everybody before the censors come down on us. So, speaking of the MPAA and things that are rated PG-13, last weekend was also the release of Morbius, Sony's latest entry in their bizarro Sony Spider-Man villain verse that, you know, may or may not be leading up to something different. I have not had a chance to see this yet, mostly because when the press screening happened, I was watching Moon Knight. But we do have Den of Geek senior movies editor David Crow to tell us all about Morbius and how it relates to the MCU in some weird ways, and what's coming next. So why don't we go to the chat I had with David Crow? So David, I haven't had a chance to see Morbius yet. But I know that you did, and you wrote the review for denofgeek.com, and you can read it over at denofgeek.com/movies right now. But why don't you tell everybody what you thought of this film?
Well, I wasn't able to see The Godfather in person, but having the chance to see, so Morbius, it's funny you ask that because we're less than a week since release. But from the time I published the review, I think about a week ago, to now, it's already become a meme as like one of the most hated superhero movies of all time. And I do think the hate's a little overblown. I think there's schadenfreude for any superhero movie that's not made by Marvel or Warner Brothers a little bit. And some for Warner Brothers for that matter. But to keep the focus on Morbius, it is a bad movie. I was struck by how much of a throwback it felt to, maybe not surprisingly, a mid-2000s superhero movie with Avi Arad, one of the lead producers on this movie who did shepherd Marvel into becoming one of the big brands in Hollywood before Marvel Studios, including the Spider-Man movies, which the original trilogy I do love. I don't hate the third one. I think Raimi had some obstacles, namely in what the movie Arad wanted to make, which we saw again in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. And frankly, we're seeing it again in a Morbius, which is very much an empty shell of a product. I don't think it's any worse than the Venom movies, which audiences seem to eat up. That's, I think, in large part, A, the character is more popular than Morbius Venom. B, Tom Hardy going ham. While maybe not a good performance, it's a very entertaining, and there's just nothing entertaining per se about Morbius. There's one dance scene that Matt Smith does that calls back to Doctor Who. Even that's being overstated on the internet. It's a 30-second clip, and the rest of the movie is just very, very turgid. To use one of the countless vampire puns, it's drained of all life.
It's interesting that you mentioned Venom, and obviously these Venom movies are wildly successful. I tried to approach these because I'm not even the biggest fan of Venom in the comics. I think the original Venom story from Amazing Spider-Man was great, but to me, that's a character that has always been kind of diminishing returns the more he's used. Millions of comic book sales later that proved me wrong in that regard. And the box office for both of these Venom movies is off the charts. But like Venom Let There Be Carnage was almost unwatchable, was just a total mess of murky CGI and ridiculous performances and a nonsensical story. Just in terms of pure quality, how does Morbius measure up against Venom and Venom 2?
Frankly, I actually think it's put together a little better than both of those movies, especially Venom 2, which was such a clearly hodgepodge post-production mess that was cut to the bare bones. I mean, so is Morbius. The ending is abrupt. There was clearly a coda, and we'll get into the ending on top of the ending. Things were deleted throughout the movie, and the third act's just a CGI. It's a CGI shit show. But you know what? All of Venom 2, Venom Let There Be Carnage, was that. Hardy is making really wild, interesting choices, even if they're not necessarily good choices. Whereas Jared Leto, who has many off-screen stories about his quote-unquote method acting, he plays this very straight, actually. I wonder if he was a little gun-shy about going big after the critical backlash to his Joker. So his Morbius is played, he's the protagonist, but he's also very flat. And I think that gets to the core problem, what you were talking about. I agree. Venom, I always thought worked better as Spider-Man's creepy stalker versus the whole lethal protector thing. But, you can't sell merchandise off that. I'm not trying to just throw stones at a rod. I think in the 90s, he said Venom was the most important character Marvel Comics had. So,
let's throw stones at a rod, because this is the guy who has been threatening us with a Sinister Six movie for at least the last 5 or 6 years now. They failed to get it off the ground with Amazing Spider-Man 2. They kind of cheated and did it with Spider-Man No Way Home. But it's pretty clear that with Venom and now Morbius and now this Craven movie that nobody asked for that's coming next year, they're building to something here. Does Morbius take us a step closer to this dreaded Sinister Six film?
Yes, I think more people know about the post-credit scene than they know about who have actually seen the movie. I'd have to think about it. It's one of the worst post-credit sequences ever. And it's really one sequence that inexplicably is cut into two. So Michael Keaton, who was the Vulture and Marvel Studios' Spider-Man Homecoming, is inexplicably teleported to the Venomverse, for lack of a better word, because it is established very tenuously on screen, but we've had confirmation off that Morbius is set in Venom's universe. And what we see is Michael Keaton just appear with the Doctor Strange purple bubble, whatever it's called, from Spider-Man No Way Home. And then he's sitting in a prison cell and goes, "I hope the food's better." I'm sure Keaton's fine doing this. A paycheck's a paycheck, but the fact that his character was one of the first, in my opinion, one of the first really good Marvel Studios villains, and you had the whole angle with him doing this for his wife and daughter and wanting to protect his daughter, and that's why he's actually kind of, in his view, being generous to the Tom Holland Spider-Man, Peter. That's all thrown out the window. He's now just kind of he's just a cartoon character. And speaking of a cartoon, it's like a bad Saturday morning one when at the next post-credit scene, you have the Vulture and Morbius meet in the desert for no reason. Vulture says, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I think it has something to do with Spider-Man," which is a name that's not been said at all in this movie. And then he goes, "I want to form a team to do some good." And Morbius goes, "Intriguing." And I just wanted to add to your earlier point, I think that gets to the larger problem with all of these movies. Forget the team up. Morbius is an anti-hero at best, but he's traditionally a villain. Spider-Man and Blade, they deal with a living vampire, a tragic vampire. And the movie doesn't want him to be that because, like Venom, they're trying to make him a hero. And they make a very generic, boring movie as a result, because these characters are more interesting when they aren't being, they aren't doing the superhero mold right down to doing the same beats from the first Tobey Maguire Spider-Man 20 years ago.
Well, that is not encouraging. Now, speaking of things that aren't encouraging, the box office for this was not exactly Venom level opening weekend numbers. This took in just under $40 million at the box office. given the state of everything, like obviously movie theaters are still recovering from, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, but we've seen a lot of kind of, mid-level movies perform pretty well so far this year. What do you think Sony's expectations were for Morbius? Do you think that this kind of soft opening weekend impacts their plans for the Sinister Six going forward?
Sinister Six, no. Morbius 2, yes, is the short version. Basically, it's not a terrible opening because Tom Rothman, and honestly, this, speaking of a name from the past, he ran Fox in the mid-2000s, which, whatever you think about the X-Men movies, he was the reason they went from the quality of X2 to X3 and Wolverine. He likes doing blockbusters on a budget, which worked out great in the terms of box office and for Venom and critical reception and box office for Jumanji. With Morbius, it's also a sign that if you make a bad movie that people don't like, if you only spend $75 million on it, you're still pretty smart because you're going to turn a profit. If you told them it was making $40 million opening weekend a few months ago after it's been moved around and tinkered with for 2 years, they breathe a sigh of relief. The problem is the word of mouth is bad. It dropped from Friday to Saturday, which should not happen for a wide release in its first weekend. More people go to movies on a Saturday, which means the word of mouth is bad. Cinema score is a C+. That's the same industry grade given by average moviegoers to Batman and Robin in 1997. If Sony's smart, and I think they're smart enough to see this, they're going to make money, but a sequel would crash and burn based off this. So no Morbius 2, but they have Morbius and Vulture, who was in a popular movie, and Venom. They're halfway there. I personally think that they maybe insisted Marvel only use 5 villains in No Way Home. This is just my speculation. So the Sinister Six, it's coming, and you have not seen the last of Dr. Michael Morbius.
Well, on that encouraging note, David Crow, senior film editor at denofgeek.com, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
David's great, isn't he? David is the senior movies editor at denofgeek.com. denofgeek.com/movies is his domain, and he is absolutely just one of the coolest, most insightful people I've ever had the pleasure to work with. So go check out his stuff. Did anybody else here see Morbius yet? Or no? Nobody? Well, that's why we had David here, folks. Yeah. So I think that is a wrap for this week's episode of Marvel Standom. I just want to thank Joe George, pop culture writer and Den of Geek contributor, for joining us. Joe, it was a pleasure finally meeting you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I hope you'll come back, and I hope that everybody here will return, because we'll be back next Thursday to break down Moon Knight episode 3 and unpack all the other happenings in the Marvel universe. But for that, I need you to come right back here tomorrow for a live episode of DC Standom, because I'm going to be talking to Sam Hamm and Joe Quinones, the creative team behind DC's Batman 89 series. And you may also recognize Sam as the writer of Tim Burton's first Batman movie. I'm really hyped about this. Please come check it out. Now, make sure you are subscribing to us wherever you're listening right now. Don't forget to check out our web home at denofgeek.com, where you can find all our Marvel and Moon Knight coverage. Drop us a line and let us know your burning questions and what you want us to cover in upcoming episodes, folks. We are at Marvel Standom on Twitter and Instagram. Give them a follow, please, because we're going to have some surprises there eventually. If you came in late today, don't worry. You'll be able to watch this entire episode on denofgeek.com or at our YouTube home, Den of Geek US. And don't forget, you can check out past episodes there, and also you can listen wherever you get your podcasts. This has been Marvel Standom on the Den of Geek Network. Until next time, remember, folks, we stand together.
Mm.